Legacy is not an easy topic to summarize. And hopefully by the end of this talk, I would have answered more questions than I would have generated through my examples. So the very common question everybody has on their mind is, I don't know whether my application will work on the latest PHP. And that's a legitimate question. So I will attempt to answer that. The types of code bases that I work on could have up to 4 million lines of code, sometimes as low as PHP 4, although to be fair, mostly between 5.3 and 5.6. So this is my starting point, and I move them to PHP 7 or PHP 8. It can have register globals, register long arrays, magic quotes, all that stuff. Undefined variables all over the place, not really checking types before feeding them into functions. It can have dead libraries, because a lot of these are pre-composer, or the libraries have been modified, ever slightly, which means that even if there is a newer version with composer, I think I'm losing audio sometimes. So you can't necessarily just replace with composer. Are we okay? Let's see. Okay, we'll try this. And sometimes it has removed extensions, right? So a little bit about me. I know I've been introduced so well. I've been coding since '97. I use things like PHP, Java, C#, Flash, ever since before it was acquired by Macromedia and later Adobe. So I work with quite a variety of things. I consider myself a legacy archaeologist. I like test automation. I like mentoring. I own a company called Filina Consulting. So if you see this thing in your bag, this is the hand sanitizer so that you clean your hands after you dive into legacy code. And I come from right about here, so I flew over the Atlantic Ocean to be here. So this is Canada, this is not the US. Right on the border there, because we go like all the way south to the warmest places, because the rest is uninhabitable. So the main sequence working with or trying to do an upgrade is find the compatibility issues, fix the issues, and make sure that the application continues to behave exactly as before. It's pretty straightforward. For the first element, PHP compatibility, which is a static analyzer, is a pretty good tool. So the first I do is I install it, and it can then scan my code to show me all the things in my code that will not work as expected in the newer version, right? So then I go to GitHub, I follow the instructions, I install it, and then I can run this from the command line. And I can specify extensions. So for example, I don't necessarily want to scan every PDF file, every CSS, every JavaScript file. So I can give it like PHP, but in the past people also use like .inc or .class, that's something, or .phtml templates, if you're familiar with Zen Framework 1. So yeah, these are the kinds of files that I want to scan, and I tell it to which version I want to go. Because it's not necessarily the latest. Maybe I want to go to 7.4 as a first step, so that we can run something that's a bit better, and then do a second jump to PHP 8, because the transition can be can take a pretty long time, and we might not want like a big bang release. So we set the target version, and it gives me a report. So for every file where it found an issue, it's going to give me the file and the line number, and then PHP compatibility will tell me whether it's an error, warning, or just thing to take a look at just in case. And it's going to give a description. So here we're using break outside of a loop or a switch structure, which is invalid, and will throw a fatal error. It's PHP 7.0. So the solution, though, sometimes it's straightforward, sometimes depends on context. So you have to be careful, and you have to research your solution. So before we apply the fix, we need to know what is the real problem and how do we make things match. So my first reference is php.net, has great documentation. So that is where I go first. I look at often the changelog at the bottom of a description of a function. I can go to the release notes, see what's new, what has changed. It also has a note on backwards incompatible changes. There are migration guides that also tell you how to go from 7.0 to 7.1, 7.1 to 7.2. So I mean, it's not complete. It's pretty good, but it's not complete. There's always little things that we find that aren't there. But also the documentation itself is not the full documentation that ever existed. Because after a while, some documentation gets retired because it's very tedious to maintain and have all the different methods, function signatures on the same page. So the rest, documentation gets retired, and so there's like an unofficial version of the legacy documentation on zen.com, where I put up the PHP 4 snapshot and the PHP 5 snapshot with a little bit of a search. So you can go there and you can find some of the older things are no longer present on php.net. So this is my own initiative and it's in progress, and I hope to be able to switch microphones. If it's only a few seconds.
This is better.
Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Back to semi-formal wear. I really like the contrast. You know, metal and... Yeah. Okay, I think it's good enough. Yeah, otherwise it would really suck for people online. All right, so so this is something I hope to develop, but you know, it doesn't have that much stuff there yet. So I try to show solutions to common problems. There's also a static analyzer called Exacat. So it has a compatibility rule set. So it's a bit like PHP-CS. So it analyzes your code and it can find things. But it also has some pretty good documentation on some of the compatibility issues and how to approach them. Also through experimentation. So because there isn't a single place for everything, you might still be surprised when you just run the code. So I like to compare before and after how it runs in different versions. Sometimes I even go to the PHP source code, although that's not very common. It happened to me several times where things are just not documented everywhere. And I'm like, well, this looks like a bug, or this looks like a behavior that nobody talked about. So I have to dig into C code, although I'm not very proficient at it, but I can still find some of the answers there. So you would have to become sort of an archaeologist, depending on the complexity of your project. So PHP compatibility tells us what to fix, but it doesn't find everything, because there are certain things it just cannot know. For example, if it uses a lot of the code uses a lot of globals, and you have variables that have been defined in a completely different class, or just a loose file somewhere, and now it's available to you. You don't know what type it is, so you don't know whether it's going to cause a problem at runtime in a particular context. So it can't know everything. It's a static analyzer. It doesn't run your code. It just looks at it. A bit like when you look at the code, you might not know what will happen. So the fixes themselves, most of them are straightforward, but the devil is in the details. So for example, when moving from PHP 5, I often see this problem. So people might mix concatenation and addition. So you would expect the content here to be 11, right? Because the response length is 10, and then you add 1, so that should be 11. And you would be wrong. This is why I like to test statements and expressions in isolation to see what they actually do in different versions. And that's where I like to use eval.org, spelled with a 3 and a 4. But if you just remember eval, you'll be able to figure it out. So it can run your code in different versions of PHP, and it can show you the output for all these versions. So I take this code, and I stick it in there, and this is what it tells me. So starting at PHP 8.0, it does exactly what I would expect it to do, right? But back in PHP 7, that wasn't the case, specifically between 7.1 and 7.3. It would give me a warning, and it will give me 1 underneath, which is not what I was expected. And it's not just content length 1, it's just 1. So it did something else there. But then, okay, so what was it back in PHP 5, the original version? Well, it was 1. So actually it never worked. So this code that was written never worked. And I have encountered stuff like that. So then you have to think, well, okay, this is a pre-existing bug. Should I fix it now? And you could. But if you fix it, maybe something down the line was depending on this bug. And now you have this side quest, and you just completely forget where you are. So I try not to change the original code and maintain it, bugs and all, and do the upgrade first so I can compare apples to apples. And then I can start tackling, you know, like the sort of the new, clearer expectations of how the application should behave. So the solution here is basically to just add parentheses to the arithmetic operation. And now it will work consistently in every version, right? And I can verify that. I take the solution and then I check, and I make sure that across all versions it works the same as it used to do in PHP. Yeah, and now I can safely apply this solution to every occurrence of this issue. Now, this is like a 5-minute fix, right? It doesn't take long to put it there and figure out, you know, maybe read some documentation. But some of them are a bit more involved, like a function that was removed. So in 7.2, each function was deprecated. In 8.0, it was completely removed. And PHP compatibility will tell you to use for each instead, which, you know, sometimes works, sometimes it's not the appropriate solution. So don't just trust what the tools tell you to do. You still have to figure it out. So like in something like while, you know, list I row equal each on the results, that would work. You can go straight to a for each and you will be fine. But it's not always the case because each does a bit more. So it can be used to read a single element, but what it returns is really an array, right? And that array contains the key and the value. And it has both the key value and it has 0, 1, which is why when you do list I row, that's how it works. The I is the key, which is, you know, index 0, and value is the second one. But if you return the full array and you start doing like array shift and stuff, you have to take into account that it actually has 4 keys in there as opposed to 2. So that's weird. That's something I didn't know until I started poking at it. But it does something else too. I mean, it does advance to the next record after it has read, or to the next element in the array. So it moves the internal pointer. So you call it once, it gives you one thing, and you call it the second time, it gives you the next one, or false if it's at the end of the array. So you think, okay, well, can't we just read the next element and advance the cursor? And you could, but in some sort of statements, this doesn't really work very well. So in this situation, because it's an else if, you can't really put 2 statements in there. And you think, well, who writes code like that? This is actually from PHP Unit 3, I think, which I unfortunately had to keep because more recent version of PHP Unit, which was compatible with my version, had behavior changes in there which would make every single test fail because of the way it initialized mocks. So I had to also port PHP Unit. So to your question, should I just upgrade things, the behavior might have changed. So you probably want to upgrade dependencies as well, right? And because it's pre-composer, technically they are part of your code now anyway. So in this situation, I thought, well, I'm going to have to call a function here, right? Because I need two statements. And so I came up with this idea of having a class where I would just shove all of these removed functions and like re-implement them in PHP. And because the latest PHP is faster, then it wouldn't be too much of a deal. And actually, it turns out it's not. So it's great, actually. It works. It's still faster to do this because you get all the other performance gains from PHP. So I wouldn't worry about too much. Do benchmark your stuff because everybody's code is different. But in every single upgrade I've done so far, this wasn't a problem. So yeah, I just re-implemented it. And the way I implemented it is I took the each function and I poked it, right? I threw a whole bunch of stuff at it. I tried different combinations and I wrote tests. And then I wrote a function, another function to satisfy those tests. And then of course, you would find all the edge cases by running the application, and then if you put a breakpoint, you dig down, it's like, okay, I missed something here, right? But now I also have some unit tests, so that's great. First unit test, yay. So what this one does, I don't want to get too deep into it, but basically if there are no elements, just return false, and then grab the key in current, so grab the key in the value, and then advance the cursor, and then return this weird response where apparently 1 comes before the 0. So again, if you use like array manipulation functions, if the order matters, yeah, it was a surprise to me as well. So yeah, I do like to test things and see what it actually contains. Never assume things about PHP. It used to be really weird. It still is sometimes, but it used to be much weirder. So like these each functions and other things, basically it's a portable unit test solution in a class that I can just drop in most projects and it's going to work, right? And I write syntax that is also compatible with PHP 5, just in case I want to have code that is still running PHP 5 while I upgrade it in preparation for release. So maybe we don't have to do like a feature freeze, on the side. And do the upgrade like on the side. So yeah, this is an approach I use quite often. And what I like about this is that if I make a wrong assumption about the behavior of the function, I don't have to go and fix every occurrence. I just fix it in one place and like, oh, now this propagates throughout my application. It makes the code a bit uglier, but we just reserve some time after deployment to clean things up and maybe address the case-by-case stuff so that we can get to the new version sooner because running an outdated version is not great. So we get to that new version sooner and then we can clean things up and do refactoring and all the other wonderful things that I like to do with legacy. But then I move on to the next upgrade. Some problems are a bit more complicated, like mcrypt, like discontinued extension. I'll use mcrypt, even if you don't use it, don't worry. This is just to demonstrate like some of the considerations when making decisions. And so think of, like, as I go through this, think of it more generically, right? Not specific to mcrypt, because I will not be able to go through all the compatibility issues if I had a year. Right. So mcrypt was removed, but you can install it from Pickle. And it's great. But, you have to remember that under the hood, it's still just a binding for libmcrypt. And libmcrypt was also discontinued, so bugs and all. So like maybe if you want to upgrade your security, because that's why most people upgrade PHP, to get the security fixes. Yeah, with the syntax flavor, but mostly security. You don't want the security part of it to remain legacy. So you have to think, am I allowed to keep using libmcrypt. And I had a situation where we said, hey, let's install this from PECL. And somebody told us, well, according to the security policy, when I create a new server, I'm not allowed to install unmaintained packages there. So like our new PHP 7 server could not have libmcrypt there, right? So that is a consideration. So ask the question before you jump into it. And also, if you install something from PECL that is compatible with PHP 7 or PHP 8, its behavior might have evolved as well. So it might have incompatibility with itself from PHP 5, which I've discovered, actually. And I had a situation where all of my cookies were empty because it was started like in a later version of PHP, it started validating the length of the key that you give to it, and then everything was just returning empty. It was returning empty as opposed to just make it work. So yeah, I mean, it might not work the same. So you think, okay, well, might as well, if behavior is going to change anyway, we might move to something different, like OpenSSL, right? The problem is that they're not 100% compatible, but you can still find like how to connect the two. So they're pretty close. Do be mindful, specific to mcrypt, do be mindful that if you use the OFB encryption mode, I don't want to get too much into encryption, but if it uses OFB, there's actually a bug in mcrypt that makes it undecryptable with OpenSSL. So you might have to re-encrypt all of your decades-old data, which might require some transitional architectures. So yeah, consider that. But if not, it's probably not such a big deal. There's a few considerations, but you can find examples online on how to move from one to the other. Another solution we discovered not too long ago was that there's a polyfill. You can go to packages and you can find this amazing package, which is called mcrypt compat. So this is a re-implementation of the extension using PHP. And the wonderful thing about it, and I had to ask for it actually, is that it can now also behave as an older version of mcrypt. So if you set so you just, basically the way you use it, you compose or install it, make sure you have the autoload everywhere, and then it just automatically uses these functions because they no longer exist in PHP, in the new PHP. So it's just going to use the functions that are defined there. But if you also, as you autoload, if you also put you define a constant to let it know that you want the PHP 5.3, I think, behavior, then it will behave like before, and it will make your code compatible, right? So the code will exhibit in the end the same behavior as before. Right, so how to test all of that? So, because you have data, again, from decades ago, how do you make sure that you can decrypt it? You don't want to test it in production. So what I actually like to do is I create some test data and I feed it into the old application and I see how it encrypts it. So now I have like original data and encrypted data. And so I want to make sure that my new application now can take this encrypted and can get back to the original the original input. And then I write this test. So let's say we have like a security component in the legacy application and it has a decrypt function. And so I give it the encrypted data that I got from the legacy application. All right, so I can do something like ABC, encrypt it, get the counterpart, feed the encrypted version, and see whether I can get to the original result, right? And that's how I know that my data will be decryptable. So that OFB thing, can be avoided. So that's how I test these types of changes. Now, another tricky extension to replace is MySQL. And some people say, oh yeah, just use MySQLi. Oh, yeah, great, thanks. It's a bit more complicated than that. Sometimes it can be straightforward, sometimes it's super complicated and takes like 50% of the upgrade time. You can also use PDO, but MySQLi will be probably closest. And it could be like a good intermediate step until you can refactor the code and and then you can use PDO. So main differences there is that the connection object needs to be available. So you connect to MySQL, and then you have to provide it whenever you want to query or close the connection, you have to provide the connection object. Whereas in MySQL, it just existed somewhere. And it gets really complicated, but I have an article online about that. It's quite interesting. So yeah, the connection needs to be available. The connection is a MySQLite type, which might not really affect you too much, just to be mindful of that. Field metadata, so you can get information about the schema. That is represented slightly differently, which might not be an issue for most applications. But if you have something like an ORM that tries to guess the type so it can do some fancy stuff, when it maps this information to an object, you can get some interesting problems there. So just be aware that there's always little things that come to bite you. Also, there's like different methods for unbuffered queries. So that is one of the biggest issues I had in the past with my MySQL extension. So, so I want to, again, show you some general approaches. When you go from MySQL to MySQLi, you can't really unit test it because it touches the database, but you can also have some global state affecting it. And in particular, MySQL, as I said, the way it kind of stores the connection there somewhere invisibly, it actually stores multiple connections, and the way it chooses which one is really confusing. So you can't really easily guess. So for example, we have a simple cycle here of connect, query, and close, right? So you connect, you query something, you close your connection. When you switch to MySQLi, right, you need the connection object. Now, how do you know you're passing the right one? You might think, well, in this class that handles all the database stuff, there's like a MySQL open, so it's probably this one. If I store it in the class, I can pass it there, but that's not always the case because, again, in MySQL, it's stored internally, and you could have another MySQL open somewhere else, and now your sort of active connection is something different, right? Or they could select like a different database, other things. I had a project where this was a particularly difficult situation. So to make sure that all of this works as expected at the end of your fix, I like to write high-level tests first because, like, typically I don't really have units that I can rely upon because older applications tend to have a lot of global state. So I like to go like higher because these tend to be more useful in an upgrade, and also later when you start refactoring, these tests will continue to be useful. You won't have to change all your tests. So in this situation, integration tests, so like between your database class and the actual database, so you could test that, make sure it behaves as you expect. Characterization tests, so some people call them functional tests, so like high-level tests, maybe using bhat where you make HTTP requests, maybe something like Cypress or Selenium where you just navigate the website and click around and fill in forms and see all the use cases. You can also do manual. I mean, it's a choice. I don't recommend it, but it is an option. So Cypress, think of it as like a better version of Selenium. There are other tools also. It's not just Cypress. There are a lot of tools that have appeared in that space. So it interacts with the application as a user. So also if you have some weird JavaScript in there, kind of takes a lot of things into account, especially if you have like Ajax that maybe messes up your cookies. You want to make sure that your state is accurately reflected in your tests, right? Because, you know, you make an Ajax request, and now when you submit the form, it will actually lead you down a different execution path than without it. So, like, it's not just the one request, it's sometimes multiple requests that interact with each other in weird ways. So the way you do it is you install it via npm, so npm install Cypress, and then you type in some TypeScript. So here it will visit the homepage, it will get a button that says login, and then you get like a little model, and you interact with it. You type in the email and password, and you press the button that's there in the form, and it will do whatever it has to do, and then you check that you have landed on you were redirected to the correct page, or that the name appears at the top, the username or the email address. And it manages Ajax weights pretty well, as opposed to Selenium, where it's a bit more complicated. So when you execute it, you can run it in the browser, where you just type npx cypress open, and you click which file you want to execute. And it just runs through, so it might be a bit small for you in the back, I don't know, but it just goes through the steps. So on one side you have the steps, and it just checks the ones it went through. And then on the other side you have the actual browser, you can see the interactions, and it goes pretty fast normally. The cool thing is that you can also stick this into your CI, so if you've been to the presentation about CI/CD with GitHub Actions, you can have that headless in the CI, and it would still interact with JavaScript properly. So that's pretty nice. You can just make sure that you don't push any incorrect changes. So yeah, I like Cypress particularly because I found it was easy to learn. So I was able to onboard team members much more easily, and it's fairly well documented. And so the way we work on that in a team, you can have your own team composition, but I usually have like a test specialist. They're not necessarily like a super high-level developer, because they mostly need to understand how the application works, what it does. So they need to gain a lot of that knowledge. So they kind of need to be in a completely different space. So they learn about the application, they talk to like other QA folks maybe, and they try to figure out how is this application currently tested, right? What does it do? What is it supposed to do? What other use cases have I missed? And so they write tests, and like several developers make changes. And so these are executed both on legacy. So I have typically like a legacy snapshot of how and I make it run in the original PHP version. And so I write tests so that they work here, right? And all the tests are passing, obviously, because the application works in 5.3, for example. But then as I upgrade to, say, PHP 7 or PHP 8, I run the tests there as well. And at first, one side is completely green and the other side is completely red, because you enter and it says something about autoload no longer being a thing, because you need like SPL register autoload now. So it tells you something like that. And so basically all the tests are failing. Everything is a 500. But at some point you will see that some tests are starting to pass on the upgrade version, right? And so you keep comparing. You make sure these tests continue to function, and make sure the upgrade is now having more and more tests that are passing. And ideally, if you have a good enough coverage, when both are fully green, you're pretty much done, hopefully. But what's great is that once the tests start to pass, the ones that fail, I can then put a breakpoint and I can start drilling down and figuring out why is it failing. So I do some of the common stuff, and then I look at what's wrong with this particular application, what doesn't it like. I can also go through the PHP compatibility checklist like in advance, because I know these will be problems, and then additional issues that I will discover as I go through the tests. And the tests then, I just keep rerunning them, and eventually I would know whether I fixed an issue. And these kinds of tests, it's quite interesting because people think that it's linear, but with PHP, as long as there's one incompatibility in the entire request, it will all fail. So the tests, first, oh my God, one test is passing. Oh, 95% of the tests are passing. So it tends to be not quite linear. So it's okay. But tests that continue to fail as you work on the upgrade, and you're like, okay, this test just doesn't want to pass. And it can signal two things, that either we're not done with this upgrade, or maybe we made some wrong assumptions. Maybe we fixed a function, to make it compatible. Maybe we wrapped a function with something so that it becomes compatible, but we made some assumption there that is incorrect. So we have to then challenge our assumptions and see whether this actually does exactly the same. The output of this statement here, the result of the statement is exactly the same as before. And typically when all the functions and all the sort of operations that happen, like appending to an array, all these operations, once they're equivalent, then all the code will normally pass. How many tests should someone write? Well, to be responsible, I have to tell you to have 100% coverage. So if it's a unit test, it's coverage of the lines of code, although there's probably a lot of dead code, so I don't even know how that works. Because some code that you have will never be covered because it never ran in the last 10 years maybe, right? It's a completely dead branch. And when you write higher level tests, you would have to consider your use cases. So you need to know what are your use cases, right? So if I try if I have free shipping for an order over a certain amount, then I have two use cases here. So I have to test both, right? So it's not all that granular, but you do have to define your use cases. And for people who have, for applications where people have maybe a manual test plan, that can be a good starting point as well. So you just reproduce those scenarios as a first step, and then you make sure that, as you continue having failures, as you test around, you capture them in new tests, right? So, but also you have to consider how critical a feature is. That's very useful to know, because you don't necessarily have to upgrade everything at once, right? So I like to sort features by criticality, and for this I have to discuss with my clients. So a login, for example, will be a critical feature, yet simple to upgrade. So I will likely start with that. Reservations, whatever you're reserving, might be critical and complex, but because of its criticality, without it, maybe there's no point to the application. So I will probably upgrade that as well, except maybe certain use cases that might be not critical. So we can maybe just comment out the entry point to that. Reporting would be medium and complex, so maybe we'll do it last, depending on how much time we have for the upgrade, because sometimes there are hard deadlines, because maybe, I don't know, CentOS has some vendor-specific extended support for PHP, and when that runs out, then we have a problem. So maybe you have, I don't know, 6 months until then, and you try to do as much as possible, because at the end of 6 months, you basically have two choices. Either you go live with something, or somebody pulls the plug on the old server because you're out of time, and the company cannot accept that liability. So something like PDF, for example, would be maybe low criticality, but very complex to upgrade, because it uses some really bad library that does all sorts of weird things that I've never seen. So we might say, okay, we'll go live. We won't have that feature as we go live, and we negotiate that, right? And we can say, okay, we're going to go live without that feature, and at least we can do something, right? We can go live with the project, and we have partial success, and we can continue operating the business, and we'll get that, we'll sneak that in the next 2 weeks after the initial release. So that's also a possibility. So just know that you can negotiate a lot of things. So I do hope you never end up in a situation where you have to decide what to comment out, basically. But at least now you have the tools and the knowledge to tackle it. So the takeaways from this, before we go to questions, is write high-level tests, because you would need to retest your application many, many times, not just once at the end. You can discover your issues with PHP compatibility, but also research the rest based on which tests are failing. So the tests also kind of provide you with a checklist, because you can then see the error messages, or if the execution went down different path that you didn't expect, then you can investigate that and find, oh, this function actually returns false instead of a null now. And also consider many solutions. So as I showed with like mcrypt, right, you had multiple options to choose from. And also don't decide too quickly, because people think like, oh, I found a solution, I'll just go with it. But if you take a bit longer and you brainstorm, somebody will come up with something quite interesting that maybe is a lot better for everyone. So do take the time to discuss this in a team. And it's good to take decisions that you can change later. So as an example, with the each function that I put in a class, as opposed to going and changing things inline, because if I make inline changes on 50,000 lines, even if I do it with automated tools like Rector, if I do it for 50,000 lines, if I made a wrong assumption, I will have to undo all these changes, fix my assumption, and then redo the changes, which might not be possible because maybe I did some other changes since then. So it can get pretty complicated. So I like to sort of make a decision in a place where, like in a function there, where I can, if I find a new case in that each function that I didn't anticipate, I can just add it there, and now it just is replicated everywhere, or immediately available to the rest of the application. Yeah. And so now I will open the floor to questions. I will publish the slides shortly after the talk, so don't worry. And do use the hand sanitizer.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for your talk. Any questions? One question.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. Do you think it's a good idea to go live with a between version of PHP? Imagine you have a project with 5, you want to go to 8, and then you decide, oh, I go live with 7 just to see in real life if I forget something.
Okay, again, it depends. So, for example, I'll give you the sort of the longer version of that so that you have multiple ideas. If you have, let's say there's a company that sells long-term support for PHP 7.4, right? And you are on 5.3 or 4.4, God forbid. But if you're on 4.4, you're probably already like past the past the time for making these decisions. So if you need to go to a version quickly, you can go to 7.4 in that situation by throwing money at the problem. But if your business is critical enough, that will buy you wiggle room for doing the next sort of major version jump. Because from 5 to 7, you have a lot of changes, but from 7 to 8, it gets worse. It gets a lot worse. So it's good sometimes to be on a supported version, like, okay, we're going to take a couple of months to go all the way to this version, and then this support runs out, and now we're going to go to 7.4, which I know it's already dead, but there's a company that offers backports, security fixes and all that. So now we can go to this version and then do another stage, and hopefully another iteration for refactoring everything and actually making it the code suck less, so that the next upgrade is super easy. Does that answer the question? Cool.
Thank you. Others? He makes you run all the time. You have to make him pay.
Please stay on this side for the question now.
Yeah, he'll be skipping gym for the next few weeks.
I'm so sorry, but it's good for you. Thank you for the talk. My question is that have you ever found yourself advising your clients to probably maybe rebuild the project and then factor in it? Like, for example, something like is really dead, and also they have like new business requirements. So you say, okay, instead of refactoring and then upgrading, we just rebuilt it from scratch.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's...
Oh, no, it's a perfectly good question. Thank you. So it depends. But I have found myself advising a client to do that. For example, there was a project I did about 10 years ago. It was built on a technology, I don't even remember the name. I think it was proprietary. And it was running on some computers, and like nobody could replicate those computers. So every time a hardware failure occurred, you basically had fewer and fewer computers that could run the application. And also in the meantime, it was built 40 years ago. So the requirements, as you said, have evolved. So if you have new requirements, you might as well build something new, and you can continue operating it as you build something new and shiny. But if you're just moving from one version of PHP to another, again, it depends is the code still satisfying all the requirements that we have today? How critical it is to the business, like how much time can we afford, how much budget do we have? But outside of some edge cases that I described, I haven't advised to rebuild, because as exciting as it is to build new projects, I find that even the worst legacy out there can be put back into shape. Just requires a bit of practice. Does that help? Okay.
Others here? One.
So you are dealing with really old stuff. How hard is nowadays to find this old stuff? For example, version 4 of PHP and libraries. Is it too hard to find it nowadays, or?
You mean how often it occurs?
No, to build the environment, for example.
Right, okay, so to build the environment, luckily PHP 5 is pretty easy to build. There's still, on Docker Hub, you can find a whole bunch of images. Going backwards in time is a bit harder, but I mean, we were able to build 4.4 recently for a project, so it requires a bit more manual work, but yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool.
We have another one here.
Thanks. Thanks for the good talk. You sort of showed some links to archived things early in the talk. Do you have a process via which your company also archives things, just to have a backup of the backup in case those things go away?
Well, I mean, I do a bunch of work through Zen, and I convinced Zen to host the legacy docs, so kind of we archived it. No, I don't think so. But it's a good thing to, it's a good question to ponder. I might, now that you said it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we don't have any questions, so thank you, Anna Filina, please. A big round of applause for Anna. Thank you. Thank you.